Hello. In June 1330, the Pope, John the 22nd, ordered the preaching of a crusade against the Latin Christian Catalan Company, which was at the time ruling the Duchy of Athens in modern day Greece. Despite being a failure, the crusade against the Catalans is one example of how the scope of crusading widened vastly over the course of time, as the papacy began using it as a political weapon as much as anything else. But what was the Catalan Company? How did it come to have rule over Athens? And why was a crusade launched against it? With me to discuss the crusade against the Catalans is Dr Mike Carr, Senior Lecturer in Late Medieval History in the School of History, Archaeology and Classics at the University of Edinburgh. Mike, thanks very much for joining us today. So,
Thanks, Alex. No problem.
Crusading against Christians, it's a bit of an odd idea, isn't it? But it didn't just appear with the events of 1330. What's the origins and the development of the concept of launching a crusade against other Christians?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it obviously is a slightly strange concept, isn't it? It seems a bit of a misnomer to have crusades against Christians, and I think most people read that and think surely that's a contradiction in terms, right? But as you say, it's an odd phenomenon, but it's something that actually has quite a complex evolution, and I'll try and sort of give an overview of that now. So as with crusading in general and crusading against Muslims, obviously the First Crusade is the origin of this, but there are precedents to religious warfare in various forms, obviously prior to the First Crusade, and a similar thing can be said for crusades against Christians as well. So throughout the Middle Ages, up to the First Crusade and afterwards, there are obviously conflicts within Christendom, which are sometimes given support from the papacy and some sort of spiritual support as well. So the investiture controversy, the conflict between the papacy and the empire in the second half of the 11th century is a really good example of this conflict between the papacy and another Christian power. And it's during the 11th century, especially, where you have the papacy giving some kind of spiritual reward or encouragement to Christians to fight against other Christians. So in 1053, for example, people fighting against the Normans on the behest of the papacy are promised some sort of martyrdom if they die in battle. In 1080, during the investiture controversy, there are absolution of sins granted to people who are supporting the pro-papal candidates against the imperial candidates. So you have these sort of, I don't know what, proto-crusades is a term that gets used for this. I don't know how suitable it is, but you have some of the trappings of what become crusades against Christians in existence before the First Crusade. So basically the papacy supporting military aggression against political enemies. But really what I suppose become crusades, or something that we would define as a crusade, and something that probably contemporaries recognize as being a crusade, is a sort of later development, something that happens probably at the end of the 12th and beginning of the 13th century. And this happens really as a sort of combination of sort of political events, I suppose, that are happening in Italy, in Europe, and also in the Mediterranean region. So in the 12th century, as I said, you have these sort of proto crusades. 1135, you have indulgences being issued against the Emperor Frederick I. 1179 as well, so slightly later on, heretics and routiers, sort of Christian mercenaries, are labelled as targets of military action by the Pope in the Third Lateran Council. But it's then around 1199, which you get people, historians often say, is the first political crusade. And political crusade is sort of a synonym, I suppose, of crusades against Christians. And this is a crusade, or supposed crusade, which is proclaimed against Marquand of Anveiler, who is an agent of the emperor, an opponent of the Pope, Innocent III, in southern Italy and Sicily. And he has indulgences issued against him, well, indulgences issued to people who will fight against him, and possibly a proclamation of a crusade as well. And this is seen as potentially this is the first crusade against Christians. But Marquard actually dies before the campaign can kick off, so we don't really know whether all the proper mechanisms of crusading were used against him or not, and the sources are slightly unclear. So even in the instance, the example of Marquard in 1199, there is a bit of ambiguity, and it's really the start of the 13th century where you have I think probably it's clearer that you do have crusades against Christians, against the Cathars in southern France, and around 1205, and also against the Byzantine Greeks in Greece and the Aegean around the same time. And this is when you get the full suite of crusading mechanisms. And when I say crusading mechanisms, I mean indulgences. And these are indulgences which are the same for going to the Holy Land. And they actually often state this. They'll say you are given the indulgences as per the Holy Land if you go and fight against these other people. So, and I think for contemporaries, they would have understood that as being an equivalent. And also you get preaching, proper organisation by the papacy in that sense, crusading tithes as well, that kind of stuff, often associated with these campaigns. So yes, it's sort of beginning of the 13th century against the Greeks and against the Cathars as well. So it's a sort of gradual and slightly murky evolution, but the concept of, I suppose, military opposition to Christian enemies of the papacy, it really sort of predates the First Crusade, but it only, I suppose, takes on crusading trappings in the beginning of the 13th century.
Okay, thank you. So just a couple of points there. When you say indulgences, what do you mean exactly? And also, what's the justification then on the Pope's part for launching these crusades against other Christians? Obviously, you've sort of suggested these are political campaigns, but there needs to be some sort of religious justification behind them. How does the papacy explain that?
Yeah, so with indulgences, I'm talking about remission of sins, essentially, for people who participate on these campaigns. As I said, these are the same by the 13th century. They're the same as what you would get if you went to fight against Muslims in the Holy Land. Obviously there's religious justification, of course, for all these crusades, and this is it obviously varies according to the target, and in, I suppose, if we look at 1205 or 1205 1210 sort of as the example of this sort of the emergence of crusading against Christians, you have against the Cathars. They were obviously heretics, so the justification is that they are they're heretics, and then with the Byzantines, so they're schismatics, so they split from the church, and they are therefore justifiable as targets of military aggression. But it's interesting because the sort of theological justification in terms of the papal documentation, anyway, it sort of is quite blurred and it's conflated. So at times the Byzantines are also labelled as heretics. You get political opponents of the papacy in Italy, for example, being labelled as heretics as well, and also as schismatics. And this is something that the Catalans are as labelled as. So you have these sort of terms which are sort of quite flexible, and they're applied to different Christian targets at different points. So there is a sort of a sort of all-encompassing justification, if you like.
And this kind of idea then continued on from the early 13th century to the early 14th century when we're looking at with the Catalan Company.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so it's quite a sort of direct evolution from the early 13th century, and crusading against Christians really, I suppose, it explodes throughout that century, and you see the emergence, especially in Italy towards the end of the 13th century. The war in Sicily at that time brings in the Aragonese against the Angevins and the papacy, and you get crusades against Aragon, you get crusades in northern Italy, and it's sort of it becomes a far sort of wider phenomenon by that time, and this is where the Catalans come into it as well.
Okay, great. So we're looking at the Aegean region and Greece at the beginning of the 14th century, but the Catalan Company came into that region around the year 1300. What was the situation in the Aegean, politically speaking, before the arrival of the Catalan Company?
Well, the Aegean, in the sort of turn of the 14th century, it's really a massively fragmented region. So it's in 12, just to sort of backtrack, in 1204, you have the Fourth Crusade, because the Byzantine Empire is shattered. In 1261, the Byzantines reconquer Constantinople, but really the empire itself is a shadow of its former self. And in that time, you have Turkish beyliks emerging in Anatolia, so different sort of groups who occupy and gradually conquer the whole of the Anatolian peninsula. The Ottomans were amongst these groups by the early 14th century. And then in Greece and the Aegean, you have lots of different Frankish states, Latin states, I suppose is another term for those people who participated in the Fourth Crusade. Also the Venetians rule Crete, Negroponte, and some of the other areas of Greece and the Aegean as well. So it's a real sort of fragmented area where you have lots of different religious, linguistic, and cultural groups, and also even within groups that we can label as being, say, Latin Christian, there's a lot of political rivalry amongst them, even amongst the Byzantines or amongst the Turks. There is a lot of rivalry between these groups. So it's fragmented in every way, and it's really a region which it's a power vacuum. There's no sort of dominant military or political state in that region, and that's, I suppose, from really 1204 until the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. So it is this real sort of fragmented and destabilized region at this time.
Okay, so within that region, you have Latin Christian Frankish states, and you have Byzantine Greek states, and you have Sunni Muslim Turkish states. So into this, as you say, fragmented area comes the Catalan Company. So what are the origins of this company, and why did it come to this region at this time?
Yeah, so the Catalan Company, they're quite interesting. So the company itself is probably established for the purposes of going to serve for the Byzantines, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But they consist of fighters who are fighting in Sicily for the Aragonese. So I mentioned a few minutes ago that there's this war in Sicily, 1282 onwards, which has certain crusades as part of it. And what this is essentially is a war over Sicily, where the Aragonese are fighting alongside the Sicilians themselves over against the Angevins, who are French, and the papacy and the Kingdom of France, who are supporting the Angevins. And the Angevins are the rulers of southern Italy at this particular point. So you have various Catalan Aragonese fighters fighting in Sicily, also Sicilians themselves. And it's these people who, and probably people from other areas of Italy, in northern Italy, there's anti-papal states as well, that will be contributing to the Sicilian War. And it's these fighters who then become part of the Catalan Company. So in 1302, there's a sort of peace, which sort of concludes the Sicilian War, though it does carry on in various guises throughout the 14th century. But anyway, after 1302, a lot of the people who are fighting in Sicily suddenly find themselves unemployed, and Roger de Flor, who was a particularly notable military commander for the Aragonese and Sicilians, basically established this mercenary company made up of these fighters. And he learns that the Emperor of Constantinople, the Byzantine Emperor Andronicus II, is having trouble with the Turks on his borders in Anatolia. And the Byzantines have a long history of employing mercenaries to fight for them. And they see this as an opportunity. So basically, the Catalan Company and Roger de Flor are employed to fight against the Turks in Anatolia. And that's the origins of the Catalan Company. And they sail over to the Aegean in around 1303 to fight for the Byzantines against the Turks.
Okay. And this kind of military mercenary company, was that quite common in Europe at this time, or is this kind of a one-off?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it is common, and you see this in Italy, and especially in, I suppose, in the 14th and 15th centuries in Italy, in France as well as part of the Hundred Years' War, and in Italy during the Italian wars. These mercenary companies do become quite common. I think the Catalan Company are, I suppose, exceptional in the fact that they serve overseas, on the other side of the Mediterranean. I think that is unusual. But this idea of a professionalized company of mercenaries, seeking employment outside of their home country is not unusual. Probably the size of the Catalan Company is larger than most mercenary companies, maybe. But this is a phenomenon of the later Middle Ages.
Okay. Thank you. So once this company, this mercenary company, has got to the Aegean, what's its initial activity there like for the first few years?
Well, initially, it's very successful from the point of view of the Byzantines and from the point of view of the Catalans. They go to Anatolia as they're employed to do. They fight against the Turks, and they win a series of of battles, and they have a lot of military success. They sort of push the Turks back from the sort of Byzantine territories in northern regions of Anatolia, and they start to steady the ship somewhat in that region. And really, in the first year or so, it seems like things are going quite well, and there seems to be a very cordial relationship between the emperor and between the leaders of the Catalan Company, and they're actually granted certain privileges. So Roger de Flor, who's the company leader, he's granted, he becomes Caesar of the empire, and he's promised the hand of one of the, I think it's the niece of the emperor, if I can remember right. So there is, he's, there is this, sort of very, very close relationship, and according to the sources that we have, things go very well, and it seems to be a very successful original sort of opening for a few years of the employment of the Catalans.
And then we have something called the Catalan Vengeance shortly after that. Could you explain what the Catalan Vengeance is?
So everything, as I say, everything starts well, and it's all going to plan. But then, unfortunately, and you see this, I think this is uncommon in Byzantium at this time. It turns out that the Byzantines can't quite pay the Catalans what was promised, and there is a bit of ambiguity here. So the main source for the Catalans is a guy called Ramon Montaner, who serves for the Catalans. He's quite a high-ranking member of the company. And he sort of, says that basically the Byzantines, they promised to pay us X amount of money. However, they just weren't able to do this. The Byzantine sources give slightly different amounts and a different side of things. But it seems like that's what happens, is the Byzantines have promised the Catalans salaries, which they can't then fulfill, probably because the empire itself is in such dire straits at this point. The tax revenues have been decreased and so much because they've lost so much territory and so forth. So anyway, you have this problem with, the Byzantines aren't able to pay the Catalans. And eventually, to cut a long story short, Roger de Flor is invited to Adrianople, potentially to sort of to meet with the emperor's son, and he is assassinated there. Again, the Greek sources and the Catalan sources give us a very different account of why this happens. But the company suddenly find that their leader has been killed, and they turn against the Byzantines. Also, know they're not going to get paid, and they launch what is now known as the Catalan Vengeance. And there's this sort of 5-year rampage where the Catalans. First, they're in sort of Gallipoli, and then they move to Thrace and sort of Macedonia area, and they ravage the Byzantine territories there, and they sort of live off the land, they enslave the population, they steal food and livestock and so forth, and basically run riot. And the Byzantines aren't really able to do much about it because the empire is so weak at this particular point. But in the context of crusading, it's quite interesting because in the early years of the 14th century, in the Western Europe, there's an idea that there should be a crusade launched against the Byzantines to recover Constantinople, the Latin Empire, and this is part of a wider plans for crusade also to recover Jerusalem. And the Catalans are seen as potential participants in this because they're fighting so successfully against the Byzantines. The Western rulers think, actually, why don't we employ these guys? They can help us in our crusade because they're already there and they're already doing this. But the Catalans, they sort of, they meet with various rulers from, representatives from the Crusading kingdoms, but they never actually commit to this in any way.
Okay, so by this point, the company doesn't actually have any towns or cities that they've captured. They're just, as you said, sort of rampaging around the area.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, there are. So in Montanel's Chronicle, he does suggest that there are points where some members of the company want to settle down in certain areas, and they do settle in areas for a short time, sometimes a year or so, but then they move on, partly because they do ravage the area, so they can't sustain them. But yeah, they don't settle properly. But also there are divisions within the company itself, and there is infighting within the company, so it's sort of is acting in unison some of the time, but it's different bits of the company are doing their own thing as well. But generally, yeah, they're ravaging that part of Greece.
Okay, and then after a few years, 1311, we have the Battle of Halmeros. This is one of the big key events. Could you just explain what happens and what the consequences of this big battle are?
Yeah, so this is sort of another development, and there's a lot of different players in the story, so it gets a little bit complicated. So the Catalans, they're waging war against Byzantium in this area of northern Greece. However, they come into contact with the Duke of Athens, Walter of Brienne. He's a Frankish duke. He's a Latin Catholic Christian, and actually a very similar story plays out from what happens with the Catalans and the emperor. So Walter of Brienne, he starts off by asking if they would like to fight for him. He's seen how successful they've been, how much they've sort of been able to devastate the Byzantine Empire. And Walter has his own issues with enemies on his frontiers. So the Catalans say, yeah, okay, we'll fight for you. So they enter the service of Walter of Brienne. They are very successful initially in defeating Walter's enemies. However, unsurprisingly, Walter's unable to pay the Catalans in the same way as the emperor was also. And again, you sort of take this with a pinch of salt. The sources, there's a lot of the sources are predominantly Catalan from the Catalan perspective, so we don't have the full picture. But anyway, what seems to have happened is the company and Walter of Brienne fall out. And then there is this pitched battle waged between the two at Halmeros, just north of Athens. And this is where the Catalan Company basically defeat Walter of Brienne and most of the nobility of the Duchy of Athens and some of the other neighbouring Frankish duchies as well, like from the Principality of Aegean and places like that. And the battle itself, it is quite interesting because the sources suggests that it's quite similar to some of the battles that are going on in Northern Europe, in the Low Countries at this time, where there is a predominantly infantry army on the part of the Catalans fighting against very heavily armoured Frankish knights. The Catalans may have sort of flooded some of the ground of the battlefield. Frankish knights charge into it, and the Catalans on foot are able to decimate them. So we don't know whether these are tropes that are being sort of perpetuated through the different chroniclers of this event, or whether it's true. But either way, the Catalans, they defeat Walter of Brienne, they kill him, and they kill most of the sort of nobility of the Duchy of Athens and Frankish Greece in general. And they then occupy the Duchy of Athens, and it becomes the Catalan Duchy of Athens. And they rule Athens until the 1380s. So this is when the Catalans are the Catalans of Athens.
Okay. And so with the Duchy of Athens, then how sizable a polity was this? Was it just the city, or did it have quite substantial land holdings around it?
It's more than the city, so it's the city and the sort of surrounding area. It's still relatively small though. So the Peloponnese, the Morea, sort of part of Greece, that is all the Principality of Achaia. That's not part of the Duchy of Athens. So it's relatively small, but it's more than the city itself.
So is it quite a significant polity within this rather fragmented region that you described earlier?
I think Athens has a certain degree of significance because of its historical importance, but it's not as significant as obviously in classical times. And I mean, it's difficult to say, but I think in the context of the Aegean region, the Duchy of Athens is a sort of medium player. It's not comparable to Venetian Crete or maybe the Principality of Achaia, but it's, still a significant power. And when the Catalans govern Athens, they're still a formidable regional player because of their military expertise as well, I think, to an extent. So the state itself is not large, but they are, they're a formidable outfit.
Okay. So the Catalans have defeated and killed Walter of Brienne, the former Duke of Athens. What is the reaction to that amongst various people in Europe, the papacy, other Briennes, etc.? How does that go down?
Yeah, and this is quite interesting. So obviously the Catalans in the point before Battle of Halmeros, they're seen as potential allies against the Byzantines and potential Crusaders, right? And then suddenly this flips. They've killed the Duke of Athens. Yeah, unsurprisingly, the perception of them changes, and the papacy in particular starts to write several missives to the Catalans and to other people in Frankish Greece, threatening them with excommunication if they don't leave the duchy, accusing them of destroying churches and decimating the land, killing Christians, and doing all sorts of horrible things. So they quite quickly go from potential allies of the crusading sort of states in the West to enemies. And also, in addition to this, something I didn't mention is that when the Catalans are serving in the Aegean region as sort of a mercenary company before Halmeros, although they're fighting against the Turks, they also employ Turks as well. So there's certain Turkish groups that fight for the Catalans, also probably Greeks. It's not absolutely clear, but it's quite likely that there's probably Greek contingents within the Catalan Company too. And they're very flexible. The company seem to, anyone who's, they're mercenaries, they're sort of, I suppose, fairly pragmatic. And any, person or group who are useful fighters will, they're open to allowing these people to become part of the company. So this is something that is actually becomes used against them in the papal rhetoric, the idea that they've destroyed the Duchy of the Frankish Duchy of Athens, and that they are probably in collusion with Turks and in collusion with Greeks as well. So really, the whole attitude towards them has sort of gone full circle by this point.
Okay, so there's religious, in a sense, religious reactions to that, in the sense that they are no longer seen as being potential crusaders, but there's also political reactions in the sense that they've destroyed the Frankish Duchy of Athens as well. So there's two different ways they're coming at it then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. And you see it later on with the Angevins who rule the Principality of Achaia. They have a claim on the Duchy of Athens. I won't go. It's sort of quite complicated. And Walter of Brienne, his son, survives him, also called Walter, and he tries to seek the duchy and tries to reclaim the duchy. So there is this sort of political side to things as well, where these sort of dispossessed ruler is trying to regain his land, and it's but then you see the religious sort of motivations mixed in with the sort of the rhetoric and things like that surrounding the company.
Okay, so there's a period of about 19 years between the battle in 1311 and the Crusade in 1330. So is there any actual military activity carried out in that period against the Catalans, or is it all just the kind of rhetoric you've been describing?
Yeah, so there's lots of planned expeditions against the Catalans that never really get off the ground. So Philip of Taranto, the Prince of Achaia, he almost gets a few campaigns together in the early 1320s. They get to a reasonably advanced stage where they don't materialize, but then one does. John of Gravina, who's a younger brother of Philip of Taranto, and they're also brothers of the King of Naples, Robert. He does launch a campaign in 1325, which goes to Greece, but it isn't able to achieve anything essentially. So he ends up returning home. The Catalans don't sort of meet him in battle. So there is one potential, one sort of expedition, but it comes to nothing. But apart from that, it's a lot of papal letters and a lot of sort of noise about how bad the Catalans are. But there isn't the sort of the concerted military action against them.
So in that sense, I guess the Catalans were quite lucky that there wasn't anybody strong enough to resist them in that sense. Then, so after this, we have in 1330 the call for this actual crusade against the Catalans. Mm-hmm. Why, at that point, was a crusade launched, or at least preached, against them? And what was the justification, particularly, for doing so?
This is quite interesting. So as you've seen, you have this the attitude towards the Catalans has changed quite dramatically in the after 1311, and you have a lot of this sort of anti-Catalan rhetoric. But why in 1330 does this suddenly turn into a crusade? I suppose the first thing to clarify is that in 1330, the bull that we have that survives the papal bull, it does seem to suggest that this is a crusade. Okay, so it's not just a military campaign that's supported by the Pope. You have the full Holy Land indulgence, as I mentioned at the start, which is granted to people who fight against the Catalans, so they will get the same remission of sins as they would for going to fight in the Holy Land. You also have some sort of preaching of this campaign in southern Italy, I think in Greece as well, and I think some sort of financial donations from the church. So this does seem to be a crusade. It's not a major crusade, but it seems to have the trappings of what we would consider to be a crusade. And the actual dating of this is interesting. And to be honest, we don't really know. There's no sort of real sort of clear indication of why in 1330 does this happen and not in, say, 1325 for John of Gravina's campaign. I mean, one of the reasons might be that in the light of the failed sort of campaigns in the 1320s, or inability of the Angevins to get a campaign off the ground, maybe the papacy recognised that actually proclaiming a crusade is a way of encouraging participation. So that's one idea. But also the campaign sort of ties in with the papal conflicts in Europe as well against the empire and in central Italy, northern Italy, so I should say. And actually, it's quite interesting because you see the Catalans being called schismatics in the Crusade Bull, and this is a term that's usually used for crusading against the Greeks. And the Catalans before they're accused of allying with schismatics and allying with Muslim Turks, for example, but in 1330, they're actually accused of being schismatics themselves. Unfortunately, in all this papal documentation, it's very typical for crusading against Christians. They don't really elaborate on why a term is used. There's not really any sort of qualification of that term. So suddenly now they are schismatics, or they're called schismatics. It might just be because they're colluding with the Greeks, but it might be that actually these conflicts in Europe at the time, they are against enemies of the papacy, political enemies of the papacy, who are also branded as schismatics. And the Aragonese are part of that. They are fighting against the papacy, so they are also considered as schismatic opponents of the papacy. The Catalans are also Aragonese, and they're sort of subservient to the Aragonese crown in some way. So it's part of that as well. And it's quite an interesting conflation of these two sort of theatres of crusading against Christians. You've got the stuff in Europe, in Italy, in Sicily against the anti-papal factions, the Aragonese, and then you've got the Crusades in Greece against the Byzantines. And actually in 1330 you seem to have the conflation, and schismatic seems to be used to sort of maybe bring those two sort of groups together. So the Catalans are sort of just part of both spheres, if you like.
Okay, so what's happening in Italy may be affecting and impacting how it is presented, this crusade in Greece.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, yeah. But I think one of the problems with this is, and especially with this particular crusade, is we have the one crusading bull. We have Giovanni Villani, Florentine writer, talks about the crusade in a couple of pages. But apart from that, there's really not much else. So we don't really have a huge amount of sources for this particular event. So yeah, these are potential hypotheses, but it's difficult to know for sure.
Okay. So once the Pope called this crusade, an army was put together. So who led the army? How big was it? And what was the actual course of this crusade?
So yeah, so Walter of Brienne, so the son of the Walter who was killed at Halmeros, he leads this crusade. Giovanni Villani, the main source of this, says around, I think he says 800 knights and 500 foot soldiers participated, along with many others from Puglia. How many others are, we don't really know, but it seems like it's a reasonably large army in the context of Frankish Greece and the Aegean. It's certainly one that you would think would be capable of sort of inflicting a significant amount of damage on the Catalans. But unfortunately for Walter, the campaign is a massive failure, and it's very similar to John of Gravina's campaign of 1325. And Walter basically he lands in sort of Greece in 1331, and he works his way from the sort of Ionian coast through to the Duchy of Athens. But the Catalans basically they don't come out to meet him. They stay in their strongholds. Walter, even though he has this reasonably sizable army, he doesn't quite have the provisions to sustain it for very long. Villani suggests that he doesn't have the materials to construct proper siege machinery and that kind of stuff. And the Catalans, they basically don't come out to meet him in battle. The following year, Walter runs out of money, runs out of provisions, and returns back to Europe. So the Crusade is an absolute failure, despite the fact that it seems to have recruited relatively well within the very modest context of Frankish Greece at this time.
Okay, so following this couple of year campaign in Greece and the failure of this crusade, then what happens with the Duchy of Athens and the Catalan Company in the years after that? Are expeditions still preached against them, or do they get slowly merged back into the kind of acceptable European fold?
Yeah, well, it's a bit of both. So in the years immediately after Walter's crusade, he tries to get another crusade off the ground. John the 22nd, who's the Pope at this time, is supportive. Benedict the 12th, his successor, also is initially supportive, but it's quite clear that this is not going to happen. And then by the sort of the late 1330s, in the Aegean region, the Turks have really become an issue for the Latin states there. They're starting to raid the Aegean islands. They're threatening Venetian Crete, threatening Greece as well. And I think it becomes clear to the Western states, especially the crusading powers in the Aegean, that the Turks are the primary threat. The papacy gradually understands this as well. And then you start to have crusading against the Turks taking off. And in 1343, you have the Crusade of Smyrna against the Aegean Turks. And this is a full-blown crusade, again, with quite significant contributions from Venice and Cyprus, and also the King of France and the papacy, and other players as well. And it's at this point that actually the Catalans and crusading against the Catalans seems to fall to the side, and instead they are seen as, again, potential people who can contribute to these crusades against the Turks. And there's discussions with the Catalans whether they will contribute to the various parts of the Crusade of Smyrna. This seems to be inconclusive. They don't actually seem to have done this, but nevertheless, from the sort of quite fragmentary sources that we have for the Catalans and the Western powers in the 1340s and onwards, it seems that there is some sort of reconciliation, and really they're not the main problem in the Aegean anymore. It's the Turks, and there seems to be this reconciliation with the Catalans.
Okay, so over the course of the decades from, let's say, 1310 to 1340, when you just when your last comment stopped, what is this mercenary company doing then if it isn't crusading against the Turks?
Well, the Catalans. So the Catalans are I mean they're ruling the Duchy of Athens. They're interesting because although they're linked with the Crown of Aragon and with the kings of Sicily, they sort of rule their duchy fairly independently. They are trading in the Aegean region. Catalan traders are sort of quite active there. I think the duchy itself, it's quite interesting that there are no rebellions of the Greek population. So it seems like they actually are relatively effective rulers of the duchy, and they have their own, border conflicts, as all the sort of states in the Aegean region do. But really, the Catalans, I think, are sort of preoccupied with, governing their own state, and they do. I mean, they are in conflict with the Turks at various points. They're also in alliance with the Turks at various points, but they're not. They're not sort of main participants in any crusade against the Turks. Probably also because Athens and the duchy is, it's slightly distant from the Anatolian coast. It's not the same as Venetian Crete, not the same as the Hospitallers on Rhodes, for example, or Cyprus, which are better connected to the Turks at that particular point.
Okay, so the rule of the Catalan Company over Athens ended in 1388. So what are the main features of those last few decades of their time in charge?
To be honest, I don't really know. So the Navarrese company are the ones who take over Athens, but it's quite a murky period. I don't really know what they're up to. To be honest, so
they, in a sense, then they disappear. I mean, not wholly from the historical record, but references to them in the historical record significantly decrease after 1340-ish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, they're not. Yeah, I think because they're not the focus of a crusade, they don't really feature in the papal correspondence in the way that they do in the sort of in the earlier parts of their domination of Athens. And unfortunately, we don't have much. Any kind of archive of the Duchy of Athens doesn't exist for our period. So there is a real sort of scarcity of sources from the duchy itself. And the correspondence with the sort of with the main European states is also relatively fragmented as well.
So what happened to the Catalan Company after 1388? Did it still continue to exist, or did it just sort of disappear?
Well, I think they just become. I think the Navarrese take over the duchy, but I think the local Catalan, the Catalans who are integrated within the duchy, I think stay there. I don't think there's a sort of a wholesale elimination of the Catalan sort of presence in the duchy. I think they're sort of more absorbed into the Navarrese are the rulers, but it essentially sort of it's this sort of absorption. But I don't really know how long I don't know really what happens with the Navarrese either after this point, to be honest.
Okay. Well, so the Catalan Company then just sort of other people kind of dissolve into the Navarrese governmental system then, I guess. But I think that's a very good point to stop this now. Thank you very much for all the information you've imparted. It's been really interesting, Mike. Thank you very much. If you have enjoyed this, please do like, comment, and subscribe. And I'll be back with another episode in a couple of weeks. Thank you.